My mother told me my wedding was paid for by her secret savings. 3 months later, I'm being sued for a predatory loan I never took. My father confessed, he didn't pay for the wedding. He sold my name to a debt collector to pay off his mistress. The wrought iron gates of the Willow Creek estate swung open with a heavy, melodic groan, revealing a landscape that looked less like a wedding venue and more like a fever dream of old-world royalty. I stood there, clutching my purse, my breath hitching as I took in the sprawling stone manor and the meticulously manicured gardens dripping with white wisteria. "Mom, we can't be here," I whispered, my voice sounding small against the grandeur. "The rental fee for this place alone is more than my entire savings account. David and I already agreed on the community hall." My mother, Martha, didn't even look at me. She just smoothed the front of her wool coat and stepped onto the gravel path with the confidence of a woman who owned the world. She turned back, a soft, almost pitying smile on her face. "Jane, honey, you worry too much. This isn't coming out of your pocket. I've been tucking away a little bit every single month for 20 years. It was my secret rainy day fund, for the one day I knew would be the sunniest of your life." She reached out, patting my cheek with a hand that felt uncharacteristically cold. "Don't you want to walk down these stairs? Don't you want the day you've talked about since you were 5? I looked at the cascading fountains and felt a wave of relief so thick it made me dizzy. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was my mother, the woman who had packed my lunches and braided my hair. I stepped forward, surrendering my financial common sense to the allure of the fairy tale she was handing me on a silver platter. As the weeks of planning turned into a blur of activity, a strange cold front seemed to settle over our family home. While my mother was transformed into a whirlwind of floral arrangements and linen swatches, my father, Harold, became a ghost in his own house. I remember sitting in the bridal suite of a high-end boutique, swathed in layers of expensive Italian silk, waiting for him to see me in the dress. When the curtain pulled back, the bridesmaids gasped and my mother clapped her hands to her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. But Dad just stood by the door, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his gaze fixed on a loose thread in the carpet. "You look fine, Janie," he muttered, his voice raspy and thin. He wouldn't meet my eyes in the mirror. I walked over to him, the heavy train of the dress rustling like fallen leaves. "Just fine, Dad," I teased, trying to coax a smile out of him. He flinched slightly when I touched his arm, his skin clammy despite the warmth of the shop. "It's just a lot of money, Janie. A lot of commitment," he said before turning and walking out to the parking lot to smoke a cigarette. At the time, I told myself it was just the typical father of the bride blues, the realization that his little girl was growing up. I had no idea he wasn't mourning my childhood. He was mourning the soul he had just sold to keep the lights on in a house of cards. The first real crack in the porcelain appeared during a final meeting with the catering manager, a sharp-eyed man named Mr. Henderson. We were discussing the vintage champagne tower when he slid a ledger across the table toward my mother. "We received the second deposit, Martha, but the bank had some questions regarding the private credit line used for the initial holding fee. They need a secondary signature to verify the pre-approved status." My heart skipped a beat. "A credit line?" I asked, looking between them. "I thought this was from the savings account." My mother's laugh was sudden and sharp, like glass breaking. She waved her hand dismissively, not even glancing at the paper. "Oh, Mr. Henderson is just being a stickler for jargon, Jane. It's a sweep account. The money moves from the investment wing to the liquid wing. It's all very boring banking nonsense." She leaned over and pinched my hand under the table, her fingernails digging into my skin just a bit too hard. "Focus on the cake, darling. Do we want the lemon zest or the raspberry creme?" She redirected the conversation with such surgical precision that I felt foolish for even asking. I watched her sign a document with a flourish, her pen moving with a practiced ease that should have terrified me. I chose the raspberry, burying my intuition under another layer of white frosting. Then came the day itself, a symphony of excess that felt almost holy. The sun caught the dew on the white roses, and an 18-piece orchestra played softly as I moved toward the altar. I felt like a queen. Everywhere I looked, there was evidence of a fortune spent. The hand-painted menus, the silk-draped ceiling of the marquee, the 5-course meal that tasted like pure luxury. My mother was the star of the show, gliding through the guests, soaking up the compliments on her impeccable taste and generosity. She looked triumphant, her head held high as if she had finally won a war. I remember dancing with my father under a canopy of fairy lights. He held me at arm's length, his movements stiff and mechanical. I leaned my head on his shoulder and whispered, "Thank you, Dad. For everything." He didn't squeeze back. He didn't whisper a blessing. He just let out a long, shuddering breath and stared over my shoulder at the dark tree line beyond the estate. I felt a fleeting sense of sorrow for him, thinking he was simply overwhelmed by the beauty of the moment. I didn't realize he was counting the minutes until the bill came due, or that every note the violinist played was a cent added to a debt that carried my name and his sins. The fallout didn't happen while the flowers were still fresh. It waited until David and I were 3 weeks into the quiet, mundane bliss of our new life together. We were in our small kitchen, the counters still cluttered with Mr. and Mrs. mugs and half-unpacked boxes, when my phone vibrated on the granite. The caller ID was a string of digits I didn't recognize, an out-of-state area code. I answered, expecting a telemarketer or a late wedding congratulations. Instead, a man's voice, cold and devoid of any pleasantry, cut through the air. "Is this Jane Miller? I'm calling from the compliance department regarding file 88 Delta. We have an outstanding balance on a short-term liquidity bridge, and we need to verify the last 4 digits of your social to finalize the collection transition." I frowned, looking at David, who was busy making coffee. "I think you have the wrong person," I said firmly. "I don't have any bridge loans. I don't even have a credit card with an outstanding balance." The man on the other end didn't skip a beat. "This is regarding the legacy celebration contract, Jane. It was signed 3 months ago. If you can't verify the file, we'll have to move to the next stage of the litigation process." My blood went cold. I hung up the phone, my heart starting to thrum a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It's just a scam, I told myself. A well-timed lucky scam. But as I looked at the framed photo of me and my parents on the wedding day sitting on the mantel, I noticed for the first time how much my mother's triumphant smile looked like a mask of desperation. The humming of the coffee maker was the only sound in the kitchen as I stared at my phone, the screen still glowing with the call-ended notification. I tried to shake off the chill from that strange conversation, telling myself that wedding vendors probably sold their lead lists to scammers all the time. To ground myself, I stepped out into the backyard. It was a crisp Saturday morning and the soil in my flower beds needed turning. I had just pulled on my gardening gloves and sunk a trowel into the damp earth when a shadow fell across the mulch. I looked up, expecting to see a neighbor, but instead found a man in a nondescript navy windbreaker holding a thick manila envelope. "Jane Miller?" he asked, his voice flat and clinical. I nodded, wiping a smudge of dirt from my forehead. Without a word, he pressed the envelope into my hand. "You've been served," he said, turning on his heel and walking back to a battered sedan idling at the curb. I sat right there on the grass, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. My name was printed in bold, black ink at the top of the first page. Defendant. As I flipped through the legal jargon, the world seemed to lose its color. It was a summons for a civil lawsuit initiated by a company called Apex Capital Liquidity. They were suing me for $64,000, plus accrued interest and legal fees. The document stated I had defaulted on a high-risk personal loan, a predatory agreement with an astronomical interest rate of 29%. My eyes blurred as I looked at the date the funds were disbursed. It was 3 days before my wedding. The secret savings my mother had bragged about wasn't a gift. It was a debt, and according to these papers, I was the one who had walked into the trap. I didn't even go back inside to get my shoes. I threw on some flats, grabbed my car keys and drove to my local bank branch with the legal papers clutched so tightly my knuckles were white. I sat across from a loan officer named Sarah, who had helped me open my first savings account when I was 16. I practically threw the envelope onto her desk. "Sarah, please, someone is trying to ruin me," I pleaded, my voice trembling. "I never signed for this. I haven't taken out a loan in years. It has to be identity theft." Sarah gave me a sympathetic look and started typing into her terminal. But as the seconds ticked by, her expression shifted from pity to a deep, uncomfortable frown. She turned the monitor toward me. "Jane, the digital signature was verified through a multi-factor authentication sent to a recovery email we have on file for you. It's an old address you used in college. And the IP address used to finalize the e-sign." He paused, looking pained. "It's a residential line in the suburbs. It traces directly to your parents' house." The The drive to my parents' home felt like navigating through a thick, gray fog. I burst through the front door without knocking, the smell of my mother's cinnamon candles suddenly making me feel nauseous. I found her in the kitchen, humming as she polished the silver she had used for the wedding brunch. "Mom!" I screamed, dropping the manila envelope onto the kitchen island. The silver platter clattered to the floor with a deafening ring. She looked at the papers, then at me, and her face seemed to age 10 years in a single second. She didn't deny it. She didn't look shocked. She just collapsed into a kitchen chair, her shoulders sagging as the facade of the perfect mother finally cracked. "I just wanted you to have the best, Jane," she wailed, her voice rising into a frantic high-pitched pitch. "You were always talking about that garden estate. We didn't have the money, but your father said he found a way. He told me he'd handled the paperwork legally through a private broker. I didn't know it was like this." "You didn't know?" I whispered, the betrayal tasting like copper in my mouth. "You watched me walk down that aisle knowing you hadn't saved a dime? You let me sign my life away for a party?" She just shook her head, sobbing into her hands, repeating that she thought Dad had fixed it. But my father, Harold, wasn't in the kitchen. He was in his den, the door pulled shut. I marched down the hallway and kicked the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the glowing embers of a cigar in the ashtray. He didn't look up from his desk. He sat there like a hollowed-out tree, his eyes vacant. "Tell me the truth, Dad," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "Before I go to the police and tell them exactly whose IP address is on this loan." He finally looked at me, and there was no remorse in his eyes, only a cold, exhausted resignation. "The wedding was a cover, Jane," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I needed a way to move money without your mother seeing the bank statements. I didn't just take a loan to pay for your flowers and your dress. I took it because I'd drained our retirement, our home equity, everything." He stood up, pacing the small room. "I've been taking care of someone. A woman I met through work. She needed things and I couldn't stop myself. When the debt collectors came for me, I realized I couldn't use my name anymore. My credit was trash. But yours was pristine. I sold your credentials to a broker I knew would pay out fast. I used $40,000 to pay off her credit cards and used the rest to give your mother the wedding she was screaming for so she wouldn't look too closely at the books." I felt a physical surge of bile hit the back of my throat. My name, my future, and my credit, things I had spent a decade building with careful budgeting and hard work, had been sold like scrap metal to fund my father's infidelity. I left the house without another word, my mother's cries still echoing from the kitchen. But I couldn't go home yet. I needed to see the face of the woman who had lived off my stolen identity. Using a history of recurring payments, I'd glimpsed on the bank's digital ledger. A name I'd burned into my memory. C. Sterling. I spent the next 3 hours playing detective. It wasn't hard to find her. She lived in a luxury apartment complex downtown, the kind with a doorman and a fountain in the lobby. I waited by the entrance until a young woman, probably no older than 25, stepped out of a rideshare car. She was draped in a designer trench coat and carried a shopping bag from a boutique I could never afford. I stepped into her path, my heart freezing over. "Are you C. Sterling?" I asked. She looked at me, confused but pleasant. "Yes. Do I know you?" I looked at the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. A piece of jewelry that likely cost as much as my wedding orchestra. "My father, Harold, bought that for you, didn't he?" The color drained from her face. "Who are you?" she stammered. "I'm the person who actually paid for it," I said, my voice steady and sharp. "He told you he was a wealthy widower, didn't he? He told you he had unlimited resources." Her silence was my answer. She looked horrified, not malicious, just another person caught in his web of lies. As I turned to walk away, I realized that I was the only person in this entire story who had been honest. My father was a predator, my mother was a collaborator, and I was the bill payer. But as I reached my car, the tears finally stopped. The grief was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. They wanted a fairy tale? I was going to give them an ending they would never forget. The cold resolve I felt leaving C. Sterling's apartment didn't fade. It sharpened into a tool. When I got home, David was waiting in the kitchen, his face pale with worry. I didn't cry. I didn't collapse. I simply sat him down and told him that the man who gave me away at the altar had actually sold me to the highest bidder. David, ever the protector, wanted to go to the house and confront him, but I held his hand and shook my head. No, I whispered. If we go in loud, he'll hide what's left. We need to go in quiet. We waited until Tuesday, the night my parents attended their weekly bridge club. Using the spare key I'd never returned, we slipped into my childhood home. The air felt heavy with the scent of my mother's expensive lilies, flowers I now knew were bought with my own stolen future. We headed straight for my father's oak-paneled den. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. I knew his password. It was my mother's birthday, a classic bit of sentimental camouflage. As the desktop flickered to life, I began digging through the folders hidden deep within his system directories. It wasn't just bank statements. I found a sent mail folder filled with correspondence to a man named Vince. In those emails, my father didn't sound like the quiet, brooding man I knew. He sounded like a cold-blooded broker. One line burned itself into my retinas. Jane is young. She has 30 years of earning potential to recover from a dip in her credit. I need the liquidity now to settle the Sterling situation before Martha finds out. He had discussed my life like a piece of depreciating machinery. He had weighed my ability to recover against his own desire to keep his double life a secret, and he had decided I was an acceptable sacrifice. David squeezed my shoulder, his grip tightening as we found the scans of my birth certificate and social security card tucked into a folder labeled construction receipts. The next morning I didn't go to work. Instead, I drove to a sterile, glass-walled office building downtown to meet with Marcus Thorne, the lead counsel for Apex Capital. I knew most people in my position would be screaming about fraud and trying to run away, but I walked in with a leather portfolio and a calm demeanor. Thorne looked at me with the bored eyes of a shark. Ms. Miller, unless you have a check for $60,000, this conversation will be very brief, he said. I sat down and slid a thumb drive across the mahogany table. I have something better than $60,000, Mr. Thorne, I replied. I have evidence of premeditated identity theft, mail fraud, and the exact coordinates of an offshore account my father kept in the Cayman Islands, an account he forgot to mention in his own bankruptcy filings. Thorne's posture changed instantly. He leaned forward, his interest piqued. I told him I wouldn't fight the debt if they redirected their litigation toward the actual perpetrator. I gave them the map to my father's hidden emergency fund, effectively turning the predatory hunters into my own personal infantry. By the time Friday rolled around, the trap was set. I called my mother and told her I wanted us all to move past the misunderstanding. I invited them over for a lavish dinner, claiming I wanted to celebrate our first few months of marriage properly. My mother was ecstatic, her voice over the phone sounding relieved, as if she truly believed a home-cooked meal could erase a lifetime of betrayal. When they arrived, my mother brought a bottle of expensive wine, likely charged to another account I didn't know about. My father walked in with his usual stoic mask, though he seemed a little more relaxed, believing his loyal daughter was going to play her part and stay silent. We sat through 3 courses of polite, hollow conversation about the weather and the neighbors. It was nauseating. Every time my father smiled, I saw the emails where he'd priced out my soul. As David cleared the dinner plates, I brought out a tray for dessert. But instead of cake, I placed 3 distinct envelopes on the table. The room went deathly silent. My mother's hand went to her throat. "Jane, what is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. I pushed the first envelope toward her. "That, Mom, is a petition for legal separation and a forensic accounting of your joint assets. I spent the last 3 days helping you realize that Dad didn't just ruin me, he's been stealing from you for a decade." I pushed the second envelope toward my father. It was a copy of the police report and the cooperation agreement I'd signed with Apex Capital. His face went from a dull gray to a ghostly white. "You think you're the only one who knows how to move pieces on a board, Dad?" I said, my voice as cold as the garden estate in winter. "You sold my name. So I sold your location." The front doorbell rang right on cue. My father tried to stand, his chair scraping harshly against the floor, but David stood in the doorway, blocking his exit. 2 plainclothes officers stepped into our dining room. The shock on my father's face wasn't the kind you see in movies. It was a pathetic, sagging realization that he had run out of people to lie to. He looked at me, his mouth opening as if to offer one last excuse, but I just looked away. I watched as they turned him around and clicked the handcuffs into place. The same metallic sound I'd heard in my nightmares since the process server arrived. My mother was hysterical, sobbing about the scandal, but I didn't feel any pity for her. She had chosen to look the other way because she wanted the wisteria and the champagne. As they led him out the door, the neighborhood quiet returned, but the air in the house finally felt breathable. In the weeks that followed, the fairy tale was systematically dismantled. David and I held a private estate sale. We sold the designer wedding dress, the fine china we'd received as gifts, and even the silver platters my mother had been so proud of. Every cent went toward the legal fees and the small portion of the debt I couldn't fully discharge. We moved out of our luxury apartment and into a modest one-bedroom cottage on the outskirts of town. It has creaky floors and a kitchen that's too small, but every square inch of it belongs to us. There are no secret loans or hidden mistresses lurking in the walls here. I'm sitting on my small porch now watching the sunset. My mother calls sometimes, usually to complain about the modest apartment she had to move into, but I keep the conversations short. I learned the hard way that blood doesn't grant you the right to destroy someone else's life. A wedding is just a day, a dress is just fabric, and a party is just noise. Looking back at the photos of that perfect day, all I see is a girl who didn't know her own strength. Today my credit is bruised and my family is broken, but my name is finally mine again. And as I watch the stars come out, I realize that the most beautiful thing I ever bought wasn't a wedding. It was the truth.